Welcome to Chapter 10, Virtualization, Cloud Computing, and Printers. We'll cover how to implement and configure virtual machines and hypervisors, supporting cloud computing services on a network, discuss printers, install and share and manage printers, maintain and support printers, and finally, how to troubleshoot printers. Client-side virtualization has two options: application virtualization and desktop virtualization. Application virtualization allows users to use applications without installing an application. Desktop virtualization allows one physical machine to provide multiple virtual machines to users, and each virtual desktop is contained with its own virtual machine. Right? And you'll see this in our labs, in NetLab, right? So here we have a Windows 10 machine that is hosting two virtual machines, one Windows 10 and the other Ubuntu Linux. Both virtual machines have its own virtual hardware and operating systems. There are two types of hypervisors, or software that allows you to run virtual machines. Type 1 hypervisor is installed on bare metal hardware and runs in place of an operating system. The Type 2 hypervisor, which we use in our labs, is installed on a machine that is already running an operating system. A Type 2 hypervisor is not as powerful or capable as a Type 1 hypervisor because it has the overhead of the host operating system and has to run everything through the host operating system. Thus, a Type 2 hypervisor is also known as a hosted hypervisor. While a Type 2 hypervisor is not as powerful as a Type 1 hypervisor, it does have its benefits. A Type 2 hypervisor is easier to install and maintain, and it is easy for developers to use to test applications. It also would allow for help desk technicians to run multiple different operating systems and system configurations, allowing them to see and work with the same operating systems and softwares that their end users are running. It's also okay for creating honeypots that are designed to lure hackers into attacking a useless system so as to learn of their presence and help defeat them. Then, of course, there is how we will use the Type 2 hypervisors so that as students, you are able to gain the ability to install and practice supporting different operating systems. So the first step to make sure the workstation can support the hypervisor, right? We need to verify that the UEFI and motherboard support virtualization, and it's enabled. That's one of the first things because it is typically disabled by default. If you're going to virtualize machines, also you need more than one CPU core. So, what is our maximum CPU cores? You want to maximize the RAM because that's the biggest factor. You can get away with fewer CPU cores, but you can't over allocate RAM, but you can over allocate CPU cores usually to some limit. And of course, you'll need lots of storage space, and you'll need some network support. At least a gigabit Ethernet card can handle and host quite a few machines, especially in just a test environment for developers and students. Nothing production-like. But if you were production, you might need multiple gigabit or even 10 gig Ethernet cards. And then any other emulator requirements you'll need. And here we're ensuring that the UEFI or BIOS is set up to allow virtualization. Right, the feature is usually switched off by default because it does have some overhead for running it. So by default, it's off unless you're going to run virtualization. You want this off. Alright, so the next few slides will go over VirtualBox, which is a Type 2 hypervisor from Oracle, we will use VMware Workstation, which is another Type 2 hypervisor. VMware also makes a Type 1 hypervisor, but for our purposes, the Type 2 is all we will need, as we're not going to run what are known as production level virtual machines. This slide is showing that you can set up and configure virtual hard drives within a Type 2 hypervisor, of which you'll do in VMware. It just looks different, from the screens. This is showing that you can select and configure motherboard settings and configurations within a Type 2 hypervisor. And we'll be able to do this in VMware as well. You can change out, what the boot disk is and other motherboard settings. You can also select and configure network adapters. This, once again, is how you do it in VirtualBox, and we'll at least see it a little bit in VMware, although this is not a networking course, so we won't get too far into what's possible with VMware. Securing a virtual machine is, for the most part, the same as securing a physical machine. Ideally, if possible, the virtual machine should be isolated and not accessible from the main network unless it's required to have network access. Our virtual machines in NetLab, they don't have network access, and that's by design by the company that provides our virtual labs. Virtual machines are just files on a physical machine, and as such, you need to ensure that there's adequate security on the files that make up the virtual machine. And finally, you need to secure the physical machine that the virtual machine is hosted on, also known as the hosted computer. That's it for this segment of part 1 video. The next part we'll cover talking about cloud computing.